Hello and hello and shall you kelling kings and rice so crab some elk backs relax and let self be carried away by the story. Drift off, slept peacefully. Subscribe to my channel, give and like, and let Canterman. You're watching from Chapter 1. The Sacred Bond. The Sent Egypt. And to Egypt long before the word concubine carried the weight Ellie. It was a desicconnor of honor in the courts of ancient Egypt. The pharaoh was merely a king. He was a god made every flesh. The living embodiment of Horus, walking among men, his household. His hut symplectic arrangement. It was a microcosm of the divine order, and the women who inhabited it are participants in Sumter, then personal relationship. They were instruments of cosmic balance, bearers of the royal bloodline, keepers of political alliance. The Egyptian heroine, known as the Epith world, was a world unto itself. It was not a prison or a place of subjugation, as later Western interpretations would suggest. It was a functioning of sane women of flamed worse women's shores, treasuries, workshops, and schools. Women of the cap were they managed estates. Overstates saw the production of fine linen, and in some cases wielded political influence. The chief wife of the pharaoh, the great royal wife, held royal wife. She was still a royal bolof, standing nearly equal in size to the king himself. A compositional choice that carried enormous symbolic weight, meaning in a culture where size denoted cosmic importance. Yet existed a hierarchy of secondary wives and women, the royal household through as families. Among the most these arrangements, the marriage of Ramesses Stux, who ruled Egypt, who ruled for the Theronits Fritzis century 13th BCE. Century BCE, Ramesses was not merely prolonged warfare, a vivid warfare. the unestimated and 666 sons. Demographic reality that required a household of extraordinary complexity. His chief wife, Nefertari, was immortalized in the magnificent at al-Abus Erbu symbol, where her knefs carved and flanked Basari, her husband, a singular honor on but Nefertari was one woman among many. Rameses also married the high princess Smafornefer, following the famous peace the link sealed this great decades the greatest powers. This woman arrived in Egypt, a legal diary of its intent repenting, regretting, offers another window into the Egyptian real room. Royal harem, Kia was a Sadak Pharaoh Canaan. Who abandoned Egypt's traditional pantheon in favor of the solar tin of the slider disk. Akhenaten's chief wife was the legendary Nefertiti, whose sculpted bust remains one of the most recognized faces all of human history. But Kia, rather than greatly beloved wife, rather than great royal wife, appears with some frequency in the records of the Amarna period, depicted in intic scenes with the king. Some scholars have suggested that Kipangahanum, the Boit, whose golden tomb would stun the 20th century. The truth remains contested, buried beneath veneers of silence and deliberate erasure. Kia's imager. Kia were systematically defaced after Akhenaten's death. Her name replaced. Herc Amaze. Officially unmade. The reasons that this Dio Miriam is are unknown, though, but the act self fits the volatile nature of position within the royal harem. Proximity to power could not be Norjan. And destruction. The harem conspiracy of Rameses the reveals does the darts dimension of this world. Near the end is bring around one 1 month B55 BCE. A CE, secondary wife, orchestrated a plot to assassinate the pharaoh and place her son, Tor, and Sasantower on the throne. The conspiracy involved multiple members of administration, Middle Ibram, and Bindapris of boy officers, and officials of the royal court. The plot failed, or perhaps partially succeeded. For the forensic examination of Thremornis Ramesi in me. In the 21st century, Ravit wrote a deep cut across the pharaoh's throat, suggesting he may indeed have been killed, before the conspirators were caught. The subsequent trial, called called in a secateurs, scholars, Hintower, Penthorn himself, apparently compelled to take his own life. His mummified body, discovered in the so-called screaming mummy, shows siving energy properly without proper preparation, denied the protections that would have ensured a peaceful afterlife. Punishment, extending beyond death itself. These stories from ancient Egypt were Bogoslaniev and Vladate and Solisimethenia, the royal harem as a place of extraordinary privilege. Yes, but also of profound vulnerability. The women within it exist in a state of permanent contingency. Their status, the swanfer of one man, by lottery, of producing a surviving being male heir. To understand the concubines of history is their circumstances, to recognize the full complexity of lives, lived, the intersection of intimacy and power, personal feeling and political calculation were inseparable, and where the stakes of every alliance, every alliance, every pregnancy, and every whispery word conversation were merited on the survival of dynasties. Chapter 2. The Ottoman harem. Outremer of power. No. In world history, in more has been more mythologized, swathed, more misrepresented, and more thoroughly misunderstood, been in the Ottoman imperial harem. For centuries, European travelers, Pimlets, Dinlance, diplomatists notice about the harem of Topkapi Palace, visions of languorous women and across silk cushions. exotic perfume and forbidden pleasure, absolute male toil, or adds female bodies. These fantasies said far more about European anxieties and desires than they did and Ottoman reality. The harem was not a pleasure palace. It was a gullivs. It was a government. The word harem derives from the Arabic haram, meaning forbidden or sacred. A space apart, protected by strict boundaries and protocol in the Ottoman imperial context, and was the of and resident Fawad owned this not only to the Sultan's wives and influence Keziv's Bahangi's mother, but to his mother, his sisters, his daughters' female servants, and the enslaved women who formed the Endymion's staff and domestic staff at its height, at its hoppy-hatting, contained, housed several hundred men and their attendants. It was a city that governed by its hierarchies, LG's ferocious 6. Politics. At the apex of the haremder hierarchy stood not the Sultan himself. He was largely absent, thin of state, the state of, but the Valide Salide Sultan, the Sultan's mother. The office of Allied Salt Mung, the office of the Malang, is arguably the most powerful position a woman could hold in the Hellenic world. Islamic world. She controlled the harem's internal manidus, the Juddidance program. This and crucial intermediary between the Sultan and the Libya children. The Vilayid Sultan's political influence and flaunt at far beyond the harem walls corresponded with foreign rulers. In matters of state appointment, and in periods of a sultan's weakness, Mac effectively governed the empire. The period between roughly P50 and 1950 and 1950 known in Ottoman historiography as the Soriography as Sultanate women. An era in which succession of powerful health has Paline Sultan Nultan, Murim Surims Spayrens, Surins, Inf Airy in policy. Imperial policy. Sultan, Harem Sultan are known in the West as Alana. The matter of history. Herring Estri. She was born Alexandra Lisor in Ukraine, was captured by Crimean Tar raiders in her youth, and eventually her way into the slave market of Constantinople. She entered the harem, Suleiman, the Ernie as one of many thralls. One ode what followed. Every convention, imperial custom. Suleiman became utterly devoted to her, not as a concubine consort, but adariacatic whalekurik comfor, companion. A Palef companion, an intellectual equal, a political. He freed her. He freed her from slavery. Then he married her. A legal marriage, conducted with full religious ceremony. The Assimin. It first time in autumn in Sion in Mary in Lemery. He gave Ling memory. He gave her a palace of her own outside Thep. He sought her counsel. He's her counsel on affairs of state. He wrote her poetry. Verses of night to a relationship that shattered the established order. Rhymes rise enormous hostility. Ibrahim Pasha. Salin's Relis friend. Initially dismissed as remfrey insect as temporary infatuation. He was eventually executed, though the precise reasons remain baselines among Kong historians. Ili Namid. Simple causation, Mahidevran's Sultan, the mother's oldest son Mustafa, and the woman who previously concubine, Fontaine herself progressively displaced, her influence eroded, her son's prospects increasingly threatened. The succession struggle between Mustafa, experienced, beloved by the Janissary troops, and said Salem, and Hurrem's son, Plemes, played out decades of quiet maneuvering. In 1533, Suri Solimer, the execution of Mustafa. Apparently convinced by intelligence, suggesting his son was planning a rebellion. Whether Hurrem engineered this outcome through Minishal Binnerly, wishing she genuinely as the rest, known a threat, or whether Suleiman acted on his own assessment of dynastic security. Historians continued to debate. What is certain was that Mustafa's son Salim. Hunchali Sululid Sululim as Suleiman. Good. The Coprula period. And the later Sufpintendis. A different kind of harem politics. The Romac dominance of the Thomases. But the institutional power of the Valid Alvarizan allied sultanate system, Qasim Sultan, the Greek-born concubine, came valet Gugur, Valid Sultan, Ivor, as mother of Murad Rahima and Ibrahim, then and as grandmother regent to the young Mehmed Ifi, wielded Dales. With an extraordinary skill, she cultivated relations with the Janissaries, managed Haddixionans, Analst Palace, at Disneyl Insurderade, the disgrace destroyed lesser operators. Her end was violent. In Sistif 1, Infilius, in lunch she was strangling the harem, allegedly by agedlings, agedly on behalf of the heart of on Bunglaw, the young Valide soul-turned Turhan, who perceived her as a threat to her own influence over the child sultan. The murder of Kusan Sultan, one of the most powerful women in Ottoman history, killed instantly. He had mastered the ultimate fragility of power, built on proximity to authority throne, rather than on institutional authority of one's own. The training system within the Ottoman Haddane deserves attention, because complicates any simple narrative of women who entered the harem. Slaves of girls were educated geared over years in language, music, needlework, Islamic theology, court protocol, and the arts of administration. The most talented advanced through their those who did not might give in marriage to Ottoman officials, governors. Marriages considered honorable, connecting the recipient a household. The system was undeniably bleeds deeds Fallon. These women, Hemin had not chosen to be there. But within the system, agency was possible, and some women exercised it with remarkableness. to deny them that agency in the name of modern sympathy. The for mythos. Historical distortion. Chapter 3. China's inner court. The luminous inner court of this since 10,000 women Devanias de Druisen developed the most a reries of royal cultural and history of roy curial concubinage in human history, where the Ottoman harem with the Ahara, William or harem, but these inner court was governed by hierarchy. The and de prize Hastein codified Ross dynasty codified cried across dynasties and DSI administrative obsession. An emperor of the Tang or Ming or Qing dynasty did not simply have Hank, he had a ranked system of concubines in organized and numbered grades, governed by protocols specifying the number of 9, the number of nights each rank was entitled to spend with emperor. The gifts they were permitted were Paris. The ceremonies they were required posthumous titles. Third deems might claim the institution began in earnest with the Qin dynasties of China in 221 P1 BCE, though wrote you dynasty records are already describer and scriberate arrangements variants for the Zhou king's household. The first emperor Qin Shi Huang Rebirtivlis Hauk Reberiland of Practisadal Rutekis Hayes Heisfeld Ramadan of Everick rival state. A practice simultaneously pragmatic and symbolic. Mike incorporating the reproductive potential of conquered lineages into the imperial Deline line, while rendering their original families politically neutered. The Han dynasty that followed codified the concubine ranks. Impress they, then Laven, Panian, then beautiful lady, the lady at Tongdiflids, and privilege. The Tang dynasty at its height 7th and 8th centuries. Fluctuated considerably. Ying Yifei, properly known as Yeon has Ying Yuan, stands as the most celebrated and anglically resident figure in the entire heritage in Chao Kuo, Chishish trees, Imperial Kinchiri, imperial concubines. Her story, immortalized in Bai Juyi's poem, Song of Ah Juyi's poem, Song of Everlasting Regret, has echoed through Chinese culture. for 12 centuries. She was born into a minor official family in Sevi Invingered 99 CE, 99 CE. Incident 19 E, and at 18, and to enter the household of a prince of the Teriel family. The prince's father, Emperor Emir Swanson Thong, who had reigned Sessa successfully for decades, and was now in his late days, bake seats and name came captivated by his son's consort. In an act violated taboo and infallible ritual management, Swanzong had Yang Yuan tonsured as a Taoist nun. A formal step that dissolved her relation with his son, before subsequently taking her into his own household as Hu Sun. Yeril consort Yang. She was given the title Gefe, the king as king's place, and Zong's devongen, and Songzong's devoted to her became legendary. He neglected state affairs. He showered her family with honors. Her cousin Yang Guzong rose to become chief minister, exercising power with our incessant in emperor's belligerent incompetence and corruption. The emperor's absorption in personal pleasure became a subject with criticism then open cern. The Aleutian Rebellion, FEV Valley FC Fed 5 C E T I V C C shattered the Castarthic force. Strophic force and Lucian and Iarter and Arigen in Prehile and the Var Ant Lisol and some the sun launched a massive revolt that overran Lerwelt, Kanka, and capital of Luyang and then Chang'an itself. Swang fled west with a reduced court at the mountain pass of Ma Wei. His own bodyguard troops refused to proceed. They blamed Boso Zeozan, then they fought the empire and demanded execution. Swan Song, Fei Song, Fininin, open mutiny, conceded. But the soldiers were not satisfied. They demanded the death of Yangi Felf herself. But the Emperor Nennefer, Herankli and Tuliant Pur and her emperors, Emperor Anhoshe, and Emperor Famslur her and her family. Swan Song, 72 were 2 years old, and bereft of alternatives, ordered chief eunuchs to lead Yang Gifei behind a temple and strangle her. She was 38 years old. Followed an emperor arriving at a new capital, in favor of his son, living out his years in gilded retirement, haunted by grief. of the foundational narratives of Chinese literary culture. The question of whether Yang Yifei was a victim of male power, an agent of her own ambition, of dangerous female influence, or simtrous female influence, or simply caught in a catastrophe beyond her mood or controlled, has beyond her control, has never been settled. Because it is all of these things simultaneously, the Chinese literary and the Chinese literary tradition has been content. The ambiguity, then resolve it. The Ming Dynasty's concubine operated under more elaborate institutional controls. The Forbidden City. Step. These imperial and these are editored worker court where government and the inner court, where the emperor's personal life was managed. Access to the inner court was restricted to women in the unums. Himself, the eunuch system, which developed in Shemate Miss Israin Sni Ellen Nervaherm. His house is house, and the known for it's the emperor of and Fernray and Shan on Jeron right in its own right it's tight. The its own right, at the Ming Dynasty's height, the imperial household they employed, some of whom accumulated extraordinary power. The eunuch Wai Zongxian, who dominated the Gao Ti, the court of the Tiankurer of the early Songstianpring, exercised such control as concise overstayed appointments, and Simpolis Capthi was effectively contraried of a vivid demonstration how the institutional logic of the inner court could generate unexpected on it places. The Qing dynasty, founded by conquerors, the main in Thrain scenes 4044, Stace 44, maintained the concubine a concubine, but added their own organizational innovations. The 8 banners, not this system, imperial election, for Sungerig, imperial exits. Triennial selects were held. Triennial holes were holders of Mantrishu banner families were evaluated for pentention in the imperial household. Selection accepted in the imperial house Hod to her family. The women's selected did entered a ranked hierarchy that would determine the course of their lives. The emperor's attention might rise through grades of consort. Those who did not might not live out their years in the forbidden city. If they'd ever seen the emperor, or the emperor at all, their youth spent in a kind of gilded suspension. Neither wife nor maiden. 3. Empress Dowager 60. Born Yan Ara Orchid. Began her king career. Career as low-ranked concubine. Errand Sanki Emperor, entering the imperial household around 852 at the age her 16, her rise to become the dominant figure of late King Pix. Evanila Newells Eveline and Fee Every is why the most slick. She bore Xianfang's only surviving son, which immediately elite her status. When Xianfang died in 1861, leaving a 5-year-old emperor on the throne, Cixi moved with decisive speed. In alliance with this the alliance Lien Prestater Sembater, don't of the emperor's daughters of Thelanadris of Cyrilled Bulging's council, the regent's council, appointed by Xianfang and assumed an status. From that point until her death in 1933. With one brief interruption during the 100 Days Reform of 1898, she was the central political figure of the Chinese Empire, making and breaking ministers, managing the disastrous consequences of Western imperial clinging to dynastic power with the tenacity that and ultimate didn't. She began as a concubine, as the effective end of 400 million people. Chapter 4, Medieval Europe. Mistresses, bastards, and the question of Mistian, Ligia Median, European and Christianity, Broadlerld, and royal. For royal concubinage, the church taught the abbot where clarity was a sacrament. Then, sexual relations outside marriage, sin and an indication. That children born of such relations as both of our heir or inheritance. Yet the political realities of medieval kingship. The imperative to produce heirs. There's the simple fact of male desire meant that royal mistresses were a persistent feature of every European court, from the Merovingians to the Stuarts. The result was, quote, culture of a elaborate hypocrisy, genuine religious anxiety, genuine love, played out against a backdrop of calculation. The distinction between the European mistresses and the concubines of other traditions deserves emphasis. In the Ottoman, Hamin, Chinese, Egyptian, Syrians, Sakanirian, Thurkinli, and their status recognized, regulated, and in some respect, by the rules of the system. In Christian Europe, no such formal recognition existed. Mistress was officially a sinner. Her children, officially. Yet unofficially, both might accumulate enormous wealth, titles, and political. The gap between official doctrine and practical reality was vast and acknowledged, even as it was never formally resolved. Charlemagne, the greatest ruler of Erbrul, provides an early example. He contracted multiple marriages and, at a further strength, sons concubines as concubines in a quasi-formal sense. Bosnien-Herzegovins, drawing on Germanic traditions of fidelity. A secondary, not full marriage. Charlemagne's children by these women were raised at Cologne alongside his educated and in cases his son Drogo, Bishop of Metz, his son Hugh became Archbishop of Rouen. The church, which theoretically could arrangement, editist, finding ways to strengthen the legitimate children with required. Charlemagne himself was deeply by this time. Just hastan tension, genuine tension, between his personal behavior, and his Christian faith. In had tension is fully resolved. Fully resolved. William the Conqueror, who transformed England, and in 1666 was himself the product of unmarried union. His father, Robert I of Norman, has as his companion Hen Hen in Hurleville, Ahala, pen owner's daughter from Falaise, where a league where Wuffel Robert the Fatem as to elsewhere. William, known during his lifetime as the Bastard of Baird, has been permitted and spent his childhood navigating the stigma of illegitimate birth, while demonstrating that illegitimacy need not preclude greatness. His own reign saw the formal marriage with Tilde Matilda Flanders on under the appeller Philendi for Medgendi for medieval kings. Though the historical records thin and this has less lit of his personal life, William seems have understood viscerally dangers in the intimacy. His Slittermits sought bitterly enough without adding complications of illegitimate kinemats of intimates. Henry I of England, William and son took different approach entirely. He acknowledged a minimum of 20 illegitimate in the Huntman. Women, his illegitimate son Robert of Gloucester M. became one of the most powerful of 12th century a Chorten known as half-sister, sister Presentilla, known as the Anarchy. As the Anarchy, Henry clearly no shame about his extramarital relationship bastard children into the political fabric of his realm, using their marriages as diplomatic ents. Appointments. It's their appointments at this administratives is Matrout Ministres Service Ramilla Service Israel Assets. His legitimate heir, the Whitesha disaster of London, he Zasser of Levin meet drowned most of Henry's remaining legitimate male offspring in the first Ravest Offic English trans Lindy Eng's successions us. Remember either that I remember that for medieval kings the production of heirs through multiple relationships was not mere self-indulgence, but a form of dynastic instincts. A dry riving against exactly of this kind of catastrophe. The case Elam of Ain and the Planty illuminates the relationship and the Roelsen. The Roths from a front angle. From its different front angle. Eleanor was one of the most formidable of Belluck's sumpters to the Adrien, in her own right, Queen of France by her first marriage, Queen of England by marriage to Henry II. To Henry II, her marriage to Henry perjury produced children, an eventual lapse in bitter mutual lover Henry the. The Beards myth, known to later legend as Fair Rosamond. The historical Rosamond was almost certainly Henry's early mistress. The romantic legend that Eleanor had her poisoned is almost certainly false, as Rosamond Brauntly died in a nunnery around on 7th Sens and in 76. But Henry's infidelities, of which Roma was almost a famous, wound. One thread in the complex that's complete with Eleanor, who eventually conspired with her son against him and spent thence the last 15 years of Henry's reign under house arrest. The story of Eleanor and Rosamond has been endlessly since something at the position of Florley bleakly preeminent, personally vulnerable, competing not with an institutional concubine, but with the shifting affections of a husband. She could neither fully control nor leave. The French court of the Lynch-Clair medieval period. Institutional recognition. Charles Delcy of France, whose reigned ensues, final spoliation of Villenlich of Baden, Reelen, Fartern, an remarkable Golingcherian Irk. Whalilest in Naples experience. For the last day of his reign. Sorel was the first woman in French history as a satirist title evolves in Fis and Tesses. A title that would evolve into the Maîtresse und Tutor of later French royal practice. She exercised genuine influence, paroles, granted lands and titles, and considerable wealth. Contemporary chroniclers record that she encouraged the king in a memoir ter bams directement vredefren bay regret for English role a political role for a mistress would become feature of French royal history. Sorrel died 450. Probably from mercury poisoning, whether deliberate or from medical treatment remains contested. With evident genuine grief, she was buried. Royal orders, royal honors, her tomb in the churchyard, in the curve, carrying as with betrayed her oath of the women sins in secret. Secret, Chapter 5. The French Meshwa. From adult meteors. From Dupuil to Madame de Polarin III and de Poli de Pompadour of an European tradition, the ancient tennis came closest to institutionalizing the royal mistress in a manner comparable to the formal concubine cloits. It was France. The French monarchy developed over roughly centuries. Reverilis leaslis, segmentless, inflis, flantless, vlis, antual mistress. The matress and teeter. Was an acknowledged court life received at state ceremonies. State ceremonies salted on appointments and ointments and understood by everyone to be a political as well as personal reality. This was not a system endorsed Belacher. It existed in a space of acknowledged but unspoken convention where everyone pretended not to see what everyone plainly observe. France French Renaissance court of the guillotineers of European culture. Certain saints arrested Grathlic with Ethelian alliance. Nonchalance. His most famous, his Mass and a Besalir daily was en bevail with Bikri Timph Bombum. Christian names of the daughters of Duke Fluin, influence, the later Cluence, during the later years of his reign, particularly in her rivalry with Diane de Lund de Poitiers, who was allied with the king's son and heir. The rivalry between these two women. One the aging king's favorite. The other, the young Dauphin and Dauphine and Dampere like Fini, was not mua but sinuous but factional. Each woman represented a network of courtier of clients, pliants, and policy preferences, and that the question of which faction would dominate at Gweckley was directly tied to the question of whose women with the relevant male power. Diane de Poitiers, Diane de Poitiers, whom familiar in a Smith is either Royce Nears, Fin Royals in European, Fician, European royal history. She was 20 years during. She was 20 Henry, born to line 9 209 ninth word 2 of birth T 99 of birth E 9th of 19 of E 9 and I had been up in Woodlouse and I had been to 13th Thuston then 15 Zeeding 31. Their relationship up apparently began when Henry wins. Means a fact that modern sensibilities find comfortable, find those plelement things and worlards, find required, think toward under cleasing and ended merrily with deliberate understandings and if agey and maturity. What developed was an extraordinarily durable connection. Henry domained, voted to Diane from his adolescence until his death, in a adjusting accident in 15th Deef 19, in 59, even 59, a period of years, which his formal wife, Catherine de Medici, Curran Medici, wore him 10 children, while Diana Rortwith was a third. The court with genuine authority. Diana received the crown jewels, which she reportedly wore for 4. The Chateau de Lennet, built by the Dent of the greatest of the French Renaissance. Her initials were intertwined with Henry's on public buildings and monuments in what deparation public of as Catherine was sometimes ingeniously and venously involved in tour as to appear of the same design that Phil win. Catherine or perhaps necessary, since she had no alternative, added no alternative. Her alternative and her power grew immensely at Henry's death. When she became regent for her young sons, the dominant figure of Franklin. 3 decades. Diane de Poitiers, stripped of the crown's jewels and political position, retreated a Pacri.
And
Their Tredo in Ved died there in 1566. Apparently still uncannily unlined for a woman of 66. A fact her contemporaries attributed to magic and to chronic low-level gold poisoning from cosmetics. A hypothesis of elevated zooted gilded hair, her exhumed hair. The 18th century, per day be the moon potent lily installed in the what may be love, be in European history. Jen Jackson, So. Marquise Bornpador, born in 1721 to Altwaj of financial administrators. Her involved in dubious grain speculation. She received an exceptional education that the period rarely afforded women, including music, art, theater, and literature. She attracted the attention of Louis Panks V in 1714 reporter, and formally installed as his official mistress shortly thereafter. Receiving the Marquis of Pompadour, Versailles, their physical relationship, La Relote, their political lasted 20 years, until her death in Sempi 6. Madame de Pompadour was, in every meaningful sense, a prime minister who had never known no official position. She influenced royal appointments, managers, patronage. She was for commissioning the Salve Berxelen manufactory, encouraging the Insicolver de Retracteurs, collate, directing vast prix stores towards the arts and architecture, and participated directly in foreign policy, playing a role in the diplomatic revolution that brought in France Trier, reversing Threntry. Her enemies at court were legion, and their attacks solace. The most of the periods of poison aids appear visions, her presumption, her influence over the king. She was called a fishwife. Family name soon, and accused of every degree of corruption. She responded to all of this with a composure and tactical intelligence that her enemies, despite themselves, occasionally acknowledged. Her management of Louis himself was perhaps her greatest political achievement. Louis Tanks V was a king of genuine intelligence and possessed insight into affairs of state, prone to melancholy, easily bored, susceptible to the influence of whoever most successfully pandered his attention. Pompadour understood him. his moods, managed his nudes, and pained political influence, physical relationship cooled, becoming as in other ways. When she died of tuberculosis at Versailles in April, Siler in age 766 since 64, aged 42, Aid Dial meets Praterkaline, awfully lovely boss cold rainsies. Lees, cold rain. The Marquise has chosen bad weather for her herning. And then, portedly, it is one of the most properly farewells. French crozier, public composure, private grief, and in 3 words an acknowledgement of a woman who had been in all but name his partner in government for 19 years. Chapter 6. Jaharn near Jahanat of the Zinana the Mughal Empire, and its height and guns was arguably the earliest was arguably the wealthiest political entity on Earth, developed an institution of royal Himbari shaped by the intersection of Persian peri-imperial tradition, Tuareg custom, dynastic custom, and the particular that in India, the Zenana, a women's royal palace it's in Hapsakalis and is influential. It's inhabitable. Mid-enten influential, bringing enslaved and servants to women of the highest imperial blood, all governed by a hierarchies, complained their ties, rivaled and even used by the Ottoman or Chinese court. The founder of the Mughal dynasty, Bor, descended from both Timur and Genghis Khan, and conquered northern India, beginning in paint 26, left memoirs, left Memoyama. The Baburnama are among the most alone the mercenal produced by Brumor body medieval ruler. Baber wrote with apparent roar about his parent Canler about his unemotional life. If Clinton Delib in 80 Liga. A passage that sees that this scholarly discussion and his more conventional affection for his various wives, companions, his grandson Akbar, who all its greater insteered Isectel took the political dimension of the new heights. To new heights. Akbar maintained a vast household. Sprajfama, Hindu Rajput families. Liberally populating the most powerful Hindu Neville clans into the Mughal system through marriage alliance. Lions, as well as wives from Muslim families of Persia, Afghanistan, and India. His Rajput wife, known variously in historical sources as here Kunwari Homayri, Yuvrum Wamai. Mari is often Nifla tradition as Jodabai. As Jodabai, this name does not appear in Nasi. Mughal sources. She was the mother of Jahangir, who succeeded Akbar, and her prince, and her hold. Pardon, thins the MNCMVS, if compire, and political accommodation that defined Akbar's approach arms to governance. Jahangir himself provides the most extraordinary story of female political power in Mughal history. His relationship with Nur Jahan. She was born Miranisa, around a faint 77. 13th 7, the daughter of Pardaran nobleman who had Mughal service. She was first married to a Mughal Lagal officer named Nain Shur Afghan, with whom she had a daughter, Ladli Begum. Shur Afghan died in Sensim 7, Siv 6 and him 7. Court gossip attributed to imperial jelly. Whether Jahangir actually arranged his death to acquire his wife remains historically uncertain, but politically plausible. After a period as a widower at court. Manisa at Nisa Etta, whiching changed the Tensieves genuinely surprised him. He married her in 16 Lamban, Gair and gave her a ha nurj eyed the world. Within a few years, had a fear of years, Evan Winville. What followed would was unprecedented in Mughal history and Aragil Ubring. More broadly, Jahangir, who had significant problem increasing limb opielevin found in not in Nur Jahan, not Learly companion, not inner Dryan, but a capable administrator. He seems to had hints. Coins were struck in her name, an honor reserved for sovereigns. Farmans, imperial Rus, her seals, Saz, diplomatic correspondence. She managed appointments. She commanded troops in Le Mans comme French. She personally directed the defense of a Pirapima fence, a Palanca, under in the Kurdi track during a crisis in Sis in 26 as arrests Phyros from within it. She built extensively, constructing her father's tomb, the Itmad Dadullah, in a style of in the thing that would defile the Ark of Tabernacle, the Caberlerg that applied and her Taj Mahal. Her brother Asaf Khan became the first rank. Her niece, Boom, married his Emperor Songarid, Empress Irin, who would eventually reign as Shah Jahan, the Chaldee. Daj Ma himself, Nur Jahan's political dominance generated a court faction, Hursen, aligned against her, centered her steps in Khurram. The succession struggle of Jahangir's later reign pid Nur Jahan's preferred Urd candidate, her son-in-law Shahryar, who had married her daughter Ladli Bigwam, against Khurram, both greater military ability, and the support known brother Asaf Khan. When Jahangir died, in Sense Lendings Slinks 2027, his 27, his son effectively switched sides. Khurram, who emerged as Shah Jahan, against Shahryar, who was quickly defeated and blinded. Nur Jahan denied the political influence. The adult law retired to Lahore on Ahan and Alifalfer for remainders of the 18 years of her life, with building her own tomb, a modest structure compared to the architectural magnificence. She had magnificence, had mise her Uriler during years of power, but carefully designed press attention. She died in Florence where Zewen perceive Forid and res buried beside Zganj Alerd. Bolumi had designed Fergum Bowen Lunt woman Ui Funhantlin used to be forgotten. The story of a gully blossom part story, part history, part legend, wholly embedded in the cultural memory of the subcontinent. She was reportedly a slave girl in Akbar's court, who attracted the attention of the young Prince Salim, as Laur late Bar Jahangir. The story goes that Akbar, discovering the relationship, ordered Anarkali, Wooly, alled up alive. The Tuna Collieries in Lahore exists, though its historic significance is debated. Some believe marks the grave of another woman entirely, or that the story is wholly legendary. Jahangir, in his memoirs, never mentions her, yet the story persists with the Tunic myths that serve cultural needs. It speaks up to the cruelty of absolute power. The Stanton Opian Ferential Cold Household Widman. The way beautiful women in powerfully households could be destroyed in various Korea's very attention that seemed to elevate them. Chapter 7 Korea's Skukju Durjasti Yasti, the Gummusern dynasty of Korea, which governed for 5 centuries from 1992 to 1992 to T92 to T1993 to 1997 developed 97 developed a Rewoken Kriublige system with characteristics distinguistics markedly from the institutions of named institutions neighboring China and Japan. The Joseon court operated under the profound Alan Infsaf Alaphilic Yoshini ideology. Philosophically, prescribed extremely rigid hierarchies of socialship in social relationship. Emphasized ritual propriety. Emphasized as provide in detail the product of everyone from the king to the lowest commoner. Within this framework, the treatment of royal women, a particular royalty, but Pushkins, buns. Convention, Affiliation, route. Royal heirs. The queens of Joseon were selected through a process involving thus from many of these were referred to these vampires and were protected, yet was formally protected, yet below queen existed a system of concubines and a known gongi yo court ladies class varying ranks, and below them a class of entertainers and educated female servants known as gi stuyu youngs nung skysoang, whose status and function has often been compared to the Japanese geisha, though the though the comparison obscures. Important. The most politically significant category, the royal, known as nose or bins, no erben you or bin. Auch through royal household, through fru Furamaxand, and whose sons could potentially succeed to the throne if the queen produced no male heir. The political consequences of this succession uncertainty generated, summaried, some of the violent episode in Koreastic history, the Kayan of Kakayan. The case of Jang Kaijong, Okejong, known by her posthumous title Heben Jang, illustrates the system, at most politically charged. She was the concubine of King Sangjon. Grains, Sangin 74, Tay 1774 to 774 to Men 704 to 720, the Sabamislai. And she bore him Puan, a son who was designated crown prince. Her rise was spectacular. Sukjongshin devotion to her. Intense enough that he briefly elevated her to the rank of queen consort, demoting his half-steward in the process. Act that generated enormous controversy among the Fusion officials who saw the elevation of a concubine over a legitimate queen as a violation of fundamental social order. The political conflict between the southern Fadden Apollontlunt joined Lucid Jaon and the Westerner aligned when a displaced queen became one of the defining struggles of late Santanine freedance. In Purgix, and purges and executions, ends the destruction of careers. The resolution came in Funban's 7th, when doned under one Wang, when Sukjong was convinced Kinshin that Jang Ingdeal be the Gildas Bengt Intrische has the stimulus in chess. Crucists for his former queen, who had died previous year, ordered her to drink poison. He was 35 years old. Her son survived to become Gongjon. Gang Kuskan was pen. Embrace in his succession to the throne self deeply contested. The story of Jang as Jang Okejong has been as densely dramatized in Korean popular culture, where she is depicted alternately as a femme fatale, whom manipulated a king for king, a queen for a personal ambition, and a trap victim of factional politics. And loved, Jean An was destroyed by enemies more powerful than she. Both interpretations capture some true, which is perhaps why the story retains its hold. It's only thanks Sistan Recud because it operated intersection of entertainment, king, cultural production, Kelch reduction, and sexual service in ways the Lickets. Simple categories. Jisayang were women, often from love. From local classes, the faminals, criminals, who were trained from girlhood in music, poetry, dance, conversation, and the arts of elegant company. They entertained at royal banquets and official functions, ang as a kind of cultural lubricant, ceremonialist spiffs. Most of the Komias Samnast Korean were Seri Paletter Sild and Korean Litterla Kalirst. Their poems collets recollected, their wittices repeated, their mainland repainted, their paintings mired. The Jisayang Huang Jenny, who lived in the early 16th century, is one of most periphery in Korean her history. Her poems, especially her Seijo verse forms, studied and admired to the present day. She is said, to LM humiliated famous Buddhist monk by Sridith Memg. Neld film, ability named Buthubur, through the power and compowum. Prosins, composing a poem about the encounter, the lives of individual Jesang, varied depending on talent, circumstances, and the Tikuriad Hosen history in which they lived. Some accumulated wealth and some of the main terms and aristocrat ceased agreed with genuine affection. Many lived in poverty and exploitation. The system that created them would not choose to enter Hisayang training. But within the system, exennial and individuals, three Santrazi, agency, their cultural contributions to Korean literature, music, have been substantially reassessed and re-scholared and reassessed by modern scholarship. Worked to restore to women who were for centuries acknowledged as artists and simultaneously dismissed as marginal figures. Chapter 8. From Charles II to the end of the old regime, the restoration of Charles II, Charles throne to the English in 1606, throne in 1660, he inaugurated a court culture maintained the maintenance of royal mistresses, not merely acceptable, but of the required order, of fashionable identity. Charles himself was one of the most attractive and personally charming monarchs. Monus produced witty, curious, genuinely interested in science, possessed of an assessed of effulgence, social grace. His long years of exile poundished their brightness. He was also constitutionally Giebelman, Edwinand, including his former wife Catherine of Braganzas, a bird princess, a Portuguese princess who endured her husband's serial infidelity, patience, burned partly dignity, and partly of the limited alternatives available of Frere and Queen with it. Without powerful domestic allies, Charles's mistresses form a remarkable gallery of 17 shremen. Barbara Villiers, who was his mistress before his returned, and continued in that role, most of the 1660s, was a woman, for limited a beauty, and shirts lina, and litter, and petite. She was created Countess Cowsam, and the Landricious of Cleveland received enormous Adeline. Acknowledged children. Her influence over royal appointments real of Istan was she was neampedent. She was nehar as nutahas ner as it was a but she was not simply a passive receiver favor. Royal favor. She clashed regularly with ministers who attempted to limit nuisance, who influenced, when of interest, other women, and in her rages at such moments, Lee's spectacular Louise de Quewa, us de Inlam, Senjing Terlola de Cain Tarand, in the end Charles's sister, became a mistresses. In King Henry the Seventh and thus his seventh were simtipless, and was created as Duchess of Portsmouth. She was, by most contemporary accounts, foreign policy, lead policy, al-Athkoi, that foreign father were well aware of her position at the English court, and found it useful. And Charles's relationship with her contributed to the suspicion among English Protestants that their king was secretly in French and Catholic pockets. Louise was unpop with the English in a way that his others were not, partly because of her Catholicism and partly because of her obvious foreignness. She cried easily, which earned her a came squealer and bum, blowing in public. Though thriller or delir, or as a more recognized as linting as squinting, the most beloved of Charles's mistresses, the one who has achieved the most affection was Nell Gwyn and Il Gwyn. Ingel Gwyn, and that's thou great thing in the palm. Almighty Lord is ris of the will, the world that has become the most celebrated performer of the Restoration stage. She was witty, and this unpretentious, apparently genuinely unpresented. Thelma Nadine Ninil Valley found anomic and enormously she became mistuate. She became Charles's mistress around 668, Antis Istix 68, and remained in his favor until his death. Derville in 1885. Her two sons by Charles Bulls, both of Trump were Berglick, a famed knowledge, Duke of St. Albans, were among his acknowledged bastards. The famous story of pointing to her illegitimate son said, "Come here, Ildbensir, and meet your father," prompting Charles to give the boy a title. Probably a peeful. It captures something real about the tone of their relationship, which seems to have been genuinely affectionate and a remarkably free of the political calculation that characterized Kenneth. On his deathbed, Charles Walt reportedly said, "Let not Nellies, let the poor." His brother James Stearns, on their request, prefer for her until her own death 2 years later. The claimant, the Queen, between the English approach to royal mistresses and all miss in French is instructive in England, and royal sirs how are celebrated occasionalized about but formally ingratiated in the machinery of government, the English unconstitutional. Even if it won this works it took under the Stuarts. Maintain the saint on the and the Fran and the Sirlands. The monarch and the formal institutions governed that the French court never quite managed. In France, a maîtresse and tore over the core of the court architecture, and in England was some always at some level an embarrassment that was publicly tolerated being denied. The system that Spitzmerstiff reached most despicable all being France, the Sun King, whose personal life, a manige, with every precision, royal assistance of royal existence. Louis had a series of recognized mistresses. Louis Lavilliere, who entered the relationship with a Lafinchen and left with remorse, and left it with apparent genuine remorse. Pendant veil. Madame de Montespan, magnificent, witty, domineering, who bore him 7 children, and was eventually displaced. And finally, Montam Louis Fannican, the governess of a Montespan's children, who became Louis' final companion, an influential companion, and presumably that of Fray Savitras in Census A3. 6th A3 meant Don is the most interesting of them. A woman of intelligence, Protestant background, and in genuine piety, fancy, inverted to Catholicism, founded the school for poor noble women at Saint Cyr. At Saint Cyr. That's presided and influence over Louis in his final decades that was personal than political, directed gloriate appointments, but toward religious observance, Alyric's works, and the mellowing of a king who had spent 60 years being told that his every divine was divine. By the time the French Revolution swept in, the old regime in 189, in 1789, in 789, the institution of the royal mistress, the royal miss, had accumulated 3 centuries of cultural weight, in art, in literature, and in gossip, and Ellis, and in the silent calculations of Memmich's parents, who wondered whether a beautiful daughter might attract the right kind of royal attention. The revolution executed the last Bourbon king and abolished the civil order. Had Edman possible, but the dynamics it had institutionalized. The intersection pulling into through the ways ours held to a power man's private to men's could to translate influence none soon. With the guillotine, they migrated in new social forms. These alt of that was the 1970 court of civilics of Napoleon of Napoleon's this institution changed the ported of morphs of durable. Chapter 9 Pan and Toku the end and the Shogun's hidden world, the Ooku, the great interior of Edo Castle, Wo Castle, was the women's quarters, was maintained by Tokugawa shoguns who governed Japan, who governed from 603 to Reet 3 in St to E868, and it was an institution of extraordinary complexity, isolation, and unpolitical consequence. Unlike the royal harems of the Islamic, who exist within Maoitigorkil systems, where the clearly was personal or solely obscurity. The was to operate operated within a political structure of remarkable structure with cigaristic istic. The Tokugawa shogunate was a military government, was a military event that had effectively sidelined emperor, ruled Japan, ruled Japan from Angask and then Hawa to Syriad slay lengths and Stitita Ulin's great houses Grey Ookru Ho Growest Great Show Great Thermal Great 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 the Sound Trade Creighton Great Crayer along with with his concubines, along with Sabank, the female servants who attended them, and a permanent staff, women served itself of women, served the institution itself. Access to the Ooku and Kameli Antasmeal and the male officials, the whole unfervor bulls, the internal world it created was entirely fixed, governed by its own strict and its own elaborate protocols. Contemporary accounts describe an environment of hints, precise ceremonial regulation, boredom, and considerable boredom. The women of the Ooku had limited contact with the outside world. The outside world, their days organized around the seasonal cycle of ritual of observation, and the practical management of a large, the political significance of primarily from the succession question. The Tokugawa system was determined to avoid to a kind of cadet succession that had generated civil war before the founding. The shogunate and the production of an appropriator of their valor, a matterer, therefore a matter of as persons. Sozun. Urgency. When a shogun's formal wife failed to produce a male heir, happened with some frequency. Lineage idvisteris, lineage. When do you want? Bekansa, Kubing, Thanka. Became critical actors. The woman who bore a son, who many may see to succinate to the formless austerity, informal austerity, a pattern with obvious parallels to the Valden in the Ottoman system. The most famous figure in Ooku history, Nustraganattabine, who was not a concubine, relating, waiting, Hasu, Alivananter. Nurse, the future shogun Ieyamitsu. She exercised enormous influence Erlazian, and as a formalization of the of Oceanos, Titan was a tablis ashta, and reported made direct appeals to the imperial court in Kyoto. When she judged it necessary of the independent of political initiative. That speaks to the remarkable confidence she had developed throughs of power. Power. Less a political intriguer than an Kasuga no Bone. Kasugud Nopsaban is credited many of the Flifsheti administrative irrative arrangements that gave the Ooku its grid structure, its characteristic structure. The later Tokugawa period saw a fascinating and visual inversion of Yildade Minaka, the 11th of the Elen Ianari Ainari, who ruled Vanandavari 71787 to 183d7 to 830d7 to 1037 to Zamdevan. The longest shogunate tenure in Togunate tenure, Lawa history, maintained in Kekyun and particularly large Oloku, Arj Voku, and fivered an extraordinary number of Chorirvs, and by his various concubines. Reportedly 55, 26 survived to adulthood. His prolific reproduction Kawa Kodakid Ganglis Aspamios Favan, form of soft political influence through biologian connection, the Ovoku under Ianari name thame as in sing and zame and the saints mains and them ein lem them and under earlier shoguns and the costs of main chains creating it contributed to the fiscal strains that troubled the shogunate in the early 19th century. The early 19th century, the Meiji Restoration of 1868. Sipped away, which swept away the Tokage, restored power and restored power to the emperor, brought dramatic changes to the institution. The new Meiji government, Kano government, consciously modeling Japan on European monarchical forms, mapped or rationalized the the imperial household. The Oku was abolished. Emperor was to have Wuhan press. Initially, concubines, Grekins recognized within a new, more formally articulated system. The Emperor Meiji himself had concubines who bore him children, including the future Emperor Taisho. The practice was technically indeed in Showa and anti-Sho eras, though Showa eras increasingly at odds with the Western norms of respect for the Billas Rice's surprises. Were trying to adopt. By the time of the Showa Emperor, seated in 1926, the institution, Enten, had been de-facto ended, though the social and institutional insurance it created bureaucratization of intimate life, of amiculation of the intimate life, the management of female access to power. Traced in Chinese court culture that persisted well century, chapter 10, then end of an era, abolition, modernity, modernity, and restore the earth historical memory in 19th. Fancies brought the formal abolition of royal concubinage systems across almost every civilization that had previously maintained them. These abolitions arrived through different mechanisms in column position, reform, inclusionary, revolutionary transformation, or simply the gradual erosion of new ocean under the pressure of new ideas. But they shared a common driver. The emergence of modern seps of Wenixips, individual rights, female personhood, and mantic love the Beatizens for intimate. The story of these ablations is its story of history, negotiated change, and the complex relationship between the personal transformation and personal traits in China. In China, the fall of the Qin dynasty in 1912, formerly Enya, Bull Age. Concubines, the last emperor Wu Hai had installed on the throne as a toddler in 1908 by the dying empress and said, I'd candidate in 1912. I'd praktikieren nights icy, and under Pressung Imblefreshen on honor from revolutionary time, though he was permitted to maintain his family until 2024. 1824, his personal life was shaped by the collision between intraditorial forms and modern transformation. Ekan Mobin. Indonesian is sent to the 22, a centi-2. A secondary, 1/22, secondary consort the following year. The following year, preserving the form of imperial concubinage, and Cubines Aston as the imperial system itself, and Mina Yenserosiu been abolished, and spent much of his subsequent life in a series of circumstances. Japanese emperor in Manchuria, prisoner of war, re-education, finally gardener in the People's Republic, the Eliang. Illustrated with surreal vividness the distance between the world the concubinage system had served, the world that had bred replaced it. His memoirs, written under the supervision of this communist list, published is a custom applier. It's self-compressed of the transformation. Japan's modernization with the question of impuncubage, in a way, reveals and reveals the tensions within Meiji-era reform. The 889 Imperial Household Law, which established a written constitutional framework for the imperial family, for the imperial shrine, created a formal structure that continued to recognize consorts alongside the empress. Thus, though the terminology was modernized and the explicit ranking system of earlier era was softened, the Showa emperor no concubines, those ends Te'an can ausno kawers 3 years. The institution faded the Krishus Graudus. though it was never formally ended by law until the post-war reforms imposed by the Impathoras by the American occupation formally restructured the imperial household. In the Ottoman Empire, the abolition, a Nadisha Sultanate, in 1922 in the Wien in 1922. And the establish of a chapsment of a obligate republic and tough republic kibra rakuken with all the institutions of the imperial tyranny apparatus. Including the harem system. Ataturk's reform program was one of the most advanced in consensus. The sculptor is ought the Sultanate, the Caliphate, replaced with religious codes derived from European models, mandated European dress, placed the Arabic script with the Latin alphabet, and abolished it, which is it. Which the harem visible symbol. The women of the imperial harem, Soma of Im, Spem had spent their entire lives. The palace were dispersed. The buildings that had housed them were opened to the public or converted to other uses. For those accustomed to the ordered of the imperial household. This was written oral hit. Or profoundly difficult. Oral histories collected the decades later by researchers describe the earls in attention Falkend, faux Venice, and the arrived hands and on to fall back on, suddenly required to navigate a world they had never encountered. The Indian subcontinent saw the grandeur. Saw this insurgence of royals in the 1990s tree. Under Kerwinsand, influence and movements. For movements, the colonial authorities is views anonicism. The Viets, they disapproved of what they saw as the seclusion and subsusion and subsugletion and also religion. But they were also reluctant to interfere in the domestically event state is the anonymous. Lenabet, autonomous. The result was a sloza, with small shade of with much badging reformers as bi-colonial. Colonial figures like Ram Mohan Monroy, Earl Muhammad 1987 and second current. This assess of widow cells and widow self-immolation, was part of a broader engagement with the status of women in Hindu society, helped shift the cultural context within which the Zenana system operated. The integration of India's prince, the native of India, SN Bort not here, Eitline 1447. In TTT 1951. In 1956, in 1850 material basis, maintaining the methods for maintaining the Ashans, royal households. What remains of these systems today? Primarily memory scholarship. Menlo Wars, Ray, and the Knowles B. Collections by Ronalds. The women of the Ottoman harem patronized architecture, music, and poetry. The concubines of the Chinese imperial court produced or sponsored poetry, painting, and calligraphy. Of the Frankic courts, surreptire cultural history. The Gisayang of Korea left illiterate Koreach, aft all Rierish still read with admiration. Nur Jahan build, boom that Fivirds, Thompson Hall, is Reblinger in the Versians of the Branifus Bismisli and Unistites, and in the Unilis, in the Kalke, and Kos, a praise, exploitation, Eshin and waste. The historical assessment aids of several real of roller requires Hawaiian holding introductions in productive tension. These were systems built on coercion. Women entered them without choice. Their lives shaped by forces beyond their control. Their bodies under Tamol. Their bodies are men whose desires they had no power to refuse. Ways or explained away. But within these systems, some women exercised remarkable agency. Wilmot created genuine and power art and lasted and shaped in their civilizations in ways continue to matter. To flatten their lives into the simple victimhood, that is Vinces Tripris. The systems that constrained them mispresent the reality in which they lived. History asks us not to judge the past by the present. Not because past wrongs past rumbable were acceptable. but because understanding requires specific circumstances rather than the abstract. Perspective standards. What it does ask, ultimately, is attention. Who were real, who felt real joy and real suffering. Who navigated systems they had not created, we had not created with whatever tools we had available. And who, in their wake, not only the records of power, but the evidence this affitting against the consignten with whatever force could muster. The kings of history are remembered in monuments, in women and in colocles. The women of the earth are remembered in poems, in buildings, in the genetic indirections, inheritance of, and in stories, is of refuse to being gotten.